Detroit, 1975. The golden age of the American muscle car was dying, strangled by emissions regulations, crippled by the fuel crisis, and abandoned by insurance companies that had made owning a high-performance machine financially punishing. One by one, the legends disappeared. The GTO, the 455HO. The era of brute force American performance was over. Or so everyone believed. Because quietly, almost secretly, Pontiac was building something extraordinary. A machine that combined European-style handling with genuine American V8 muscle. A car with a layout nobody in Detroit had dared attempt. Striking, fast, and genuinely different. And then it vanished. Almost nobody remembers it today, but the question worth asking is this. How does one of Pontiac's most promising performance cars simply disappear from history? And could it have saved the brand entirely? To understand why this car mattered, you have to understand what Pontiac, and all of Detroit, was facing in the early 1970s. The muscle car era hadn't faded gently. It had been systematically dismantled. Federal emissions regulations arrived first, forcing engineers to detune engines that had once defined American performance. Compression ratios dropped dramatically. Horsepower numbers, once proudly advertised on window stickers, quietly disappeared. Then came the 1973 oil crisis, and almost overnight, the V8 became a symbol of excess rather than excitement. Insurance companies had already been aggressively penalizing high-performance vehicles for years, pricing younger buyers completely out of the market. Pontiac felt every blow. The brand that had built its entire identity around performance, the GTO, the Firebird, the thundering Trans Am, suddenly had no clear direction. The engines were weakening, the buyers were changing, the era was ending. But across the Atlantic, something different was happening. European manufacturers weren't abandoning performance, they were redefining it. Lighter cars, balanced chassis, driver-focused engineering, and a handful of Pontiac engineers were paying very close attention. What if American performance didn't have to die? What if it simply had to evolve into something smarter, sharper, and genuinely world-class? That question was about to produce something remarkable. Pontiac had always known exactly what it was. The brand wasn't Chevrolet's economy play, and it wasn't Cadillac's luxury statement. Pontiac was the driver's division, the brand for people who wanted to feel something behind the wheel. But by the mid-1970s, that identity had become almost impossible to sustain. Large displacement engines were increasingly difficult to engineer around tightening federal standards. The traditional muscle car formula, massive cubic inches, brutal straight-line acceleration, everything sacrificed for the quarter mile, was becoming not just unpopular, but genuinely unworkable. Emissions equipment was robbing what little power remained. The formula was broken. Yet surrendering completely wasn't an option either. Becoming just another anonymous economy brand would have meant abandoning everything Pontiac stood for. So the engineers began thinking differently. What if the answer wasn't a bigger engine, but a better car? Lighter, more balanced, dynamically sophisticated in ways American manufacturers had rarely attempted. They looked toward Europe, toward grand touring machines that delivered genuine driving engagement without relying solely on displacement. The idea forming inside Pontiac's engineering department was unconventional, ambitious, and genuinely exciting. It was also unlike anything the brand had ever built before. Pontiac had always attracted a certain kind of engineer, the kind who pushed back against convention, the kind who believed that a General Motors product could genuinely compete with the best performance cars in the world, not just on American drag strips, but on winding roads, in corners, and over long, demanding distances. The division had proven it before. The original GTO hadn't been a corporate directive. It had been a quiet act of rebellion by engineers who believed in the product more than the rulebook. That spirit never entirely disappeared, even as the muscle car era collapsed around them. Now, a new generation of Pontiac planners and engineers saw a different opportunity emerging from the wreckage. Not a muscle car, not an economy car, something genuinely sophisticated. A grand touring machine capable of engaging a driver the way European coupes could, while still carrying real American V8 power under the hood. They worked with existing GM architecture, but refined it seriously. Suspension tuning was rethought. The driving environment was engineered with purpose. The exterior design was clean, modern, and deliberately European in proportion, a deliberate departure from the heavy, aggressive styling of the previous decade. This wasn't just another Pontiac, it was a statement of intent. The idea was straightforward, but the execution was genuinely radical by American standards. Pontiac's engineers took a relatively lightweight platform and made a decision that set this car apart from virtually everything else Detroit was producing at the time. They mounted the V8 engine at the front and relocated the transaxle to the rear axle. A torque tube connected the two, carrying drive from one end of the car to the other. The result was something American manufacturers almost never achieved: near-perfect 50-50 weight distribution. Think about what that meant in practice. Every traditional muscle car carried the crushing weight of its engine directly over the front wheels, creating handling characteristics that were predictable in a straight line and challenging everywhere else. This Pontiac was fundamentally different. The weight was balanced, the chassis was neutral, the car wanted to corner. Engineers tuned the suspension specifically for road holding rather than drag strip launches. The steering was responsive and direct. The ride height was low, the stance was wide, and the overall proportions communicated something American cars rarely did: genuine dynamic intent. Road testers were surprised. Here was a V8-powered machine from Detroit that actually handled, that changed direction with confidence, that rewarded a driver willing to push it through corners rather than simply point it down a straight. Pontiac had essentially built a European grand tourer with an American heart. The formula was compelling, sophisticated, and ahead of its time. On paper, it was exactly what the industry needed. When automotive journalists finally got the car on the road, the response was telling. This wasn't a machine that announced itself through brute acceleration or exhaust thunder. It didn't dominate a drag strip or produce the kind of raw quarter-mile numbers that had traditionally defined Pontiac performance. By mid-1970s standards, those metrics were increasingly irrelevant anyway. Neutered engines and emissions equipment had made straight-line bragging rights almost meaningless across the entire industry. What the car delivered instead was something far more unusual coming from Detroit: genuine driving dynamics. Reviewers noted the composed, planted feeling through corners. The steering communicated the road with a directness that American cars rarely offered. The chassis felt balanced and predictable, responding to driver inputs with a precision that reminded testers of European grand touring machines rather than domestic iron. The V8 still produced enough torque to satisfy, but the real story was always the chassis beneath it. For drivers willing to engage with it, to actually use the corners, to push through a winding road rather than simply travel it, the car was revelatory. Yet, despite genuinely positive press, something unexpected happened. The accolades didn't translate into cultural momentum. Enthusiasm among journalists failed to ignite enthusiasm among buyers. Showroom traffic remained underwhelming. Pontiac had built exactly the right car, and somehow almost nobody noticed. The engineering was sound, the concept was ahead of its time, so why didn't it work? The answer wasn't found on the road, it was found in the showroom, in the boardroom, and in the broader cultural anxiety gripping America during the mid-1970s. Buyers weren't thinking about handling dynamics or weight distribution, they were thinking about fuel bills, economic uncertainty, and whether they could justify anything beyond basic transportation. Performance cars felt indulgent in a way they never had before. The market had fundamentally shifted, and no amount of positive press could override that reality. Inside General Motors, internal politics created their own obstacles. Resources were constrained. Divisions competed for development budgets. A high-performance engine upgrade that might have genuinely elevated the car never materialized. A marketing campaign bold enough to properly communicate what Pontiac had built never arrived either. The car existed in an uncomfortable space, too sophisticated for buyers expecting traditional muscle, too American for enthusiasts already committed to European alternatives. A small community of drivers recognized its brilliance. But brilliance without proper support and timing rarely survives. Quietly, without ceremony, the car began its slow drift toward obscurity. History has a way of reassessing things the market once ignored. Today, automotive historians and serious enthusiasts look at this car with a mixture of admiration and genuine sadness. Because, viewed from a distance, what Pontiac achieved becomes clearer, and the missed opportunity becomes more painful. The transaxle layout, the balanced chassis, the grand touring philosophy, these weren't dead ends, they were previews, ideas that would eventually define some of the most celebrated performance cars ever built. Pontiac had arrived at the right destination, simply in the wrong decade. Had the platform received continued development, more power, stronger identity, committed marketing, it might have become the foundation of everything Pontiac needed to survive the difficult decades ahead. Instead, the division retreated towards safer choices, gradually losing the distinctive character that had once made it extraordinary. The brand that had dared to be different slowly became indistinguishable. This car deserved better. A bolder engine, a louder champion, a market ready to understand it. It received none of those things, but it remains, quietly, stubbornly, one of the most fascinating what-if moments in American automotive history.